Let's take another dive into the Gospel of John. This week we're looking at chapter 4, verses 1 through 26, and diving into the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. As Jim said in last week's deep dive, John does this thing throughout his Gospel where he pairs elements and stories together around a common theme. Last week we looked at Nicodemus and how he came to Jesus at night, and in this story Jesus meets a Samaritan woman during the day at a well. Let's pick up in verse 1. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. The Jews and the Samaritans had an adversarial relationship. In fact, most Jews traveling this way would go miles out of their way in greater distances just to avoid passing through Samaria. The most prominent feature in this passage, just as with Nicodemus, is this dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman that proceeds from this point. This is one of the longest dialogues in the Gospel of John, giving it a prominent place. And scholars generally divide this dialogue into two sections, each of which is introduced and begins with a request or a command from Jesus. So let's look at that first section in verse 7. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. As Jesus makes this request for water, he brings forth imagery from 1 Kings, this imagery of Elijah asking the widow of Sidon for a drink. In both occurrences, a man is interrupting a woman engaging in household work and requesting this gesture of hospitality. The parallel between Jesus and Elijah here brings forth the image of Jesus as a prophet into this encounter. And this is a theme that will be prominent throughout the conversation, especially when we get to verse 19. There's also a literary device at play here, one that's seen throughout the Old Testament of men meeting their wives for the first time at the well just outside town. Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, and Moses and Zipporah are all famous Old Testament narratives of men meeting their wives at the well. In this encounter, however, the betrothal is being reworked. This image is being reworked. And Jesus is not here looking for a bride, but rather looking for a witness that will recognize the Messiah and bring to him the despised people. Wedding imagery is also prominent throughout John's Gospel, and it's used throughout as a metaphor for the coming Messiah and the eschatological or the end times eternal fulfillment. In this setting with the Samaritan woman, John is stating clearly that the Messiah comes not only to Israel, to the Jews, but also to those who are marginalized, the Samaritans in this case. Picking up in verse 9, let's continue. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Let's pause there for a moment. Living water, this phrase, is a play on words that has two possible meanings if you think about it. The first meaning is fresh, running water, as opposed to still or stagnant water in a cistern. The living describing the water, the movement of water flowing forth from a spring. The second possible meaning, or the second way that this phrase could be understood, is as life-giving water, or living in the sense that water gives life to those who drink it. The Samaritan woman in this case only hears or only understands the first meaning, that meaning of running water that flows forth from a spring. And this is very similar, to go back to last week, to the conversation with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus got stuck on the phrase born again to mean that one had to be physically born again, while Jesus was more talking about being born from above in an eternal sense. With the Samaritan woman, Jesus is not talking about just running water, but life-giving water, while the woman is only able to focus on water that flows. Continuing on in verse 13, Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water that I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." So at this point, Jesus has brought this woman along in her understanding, but she still does not fully realize that Jesus is talking about eternal life. What follows is where Jesus sort of goes from preaching and teaching to meddling. He takes this metaphor, this talk of living water and this imagery of meeting at the well, and he grounds the truth in the woman's own life, in her own experience. And he does this, he begins this conversation, he opens this door by issuing her a command to call her husband. So picking up in verse 16, he told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say that you have no husband. The fact is you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." The woman confesses that Jesus is a prophet, going back to that imagery of Elijah asking for water. But her response also illustrates that she's still hung up on this present reality of the situation between the Samaritans and the Jews. The Samaritans worship at the well of Jacob, while the Jews worship in Jerusalem and claim that and teach that the true worship must occur in Jerusalem, and that's just the way it is. So let's continue on in verse 21. "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." Jesus responds to the woman and directs her attention away from the present age and the geographical and political separation of the Jews and Samaritans, and refocuses it to the future, towards the eternal, and towards a time when the world's categories of Jew and Samaritan will be irrelevant, and true worshipers will not worship in a specific location, but worship in spirit and in truth. And in fact, Jesus says that time is coming and is here and now. Picking up in verse 25, the woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us." This response indicates that the woman has heard and understood the eternal promise in Jesus' words, but not the fulfillment. The Samaritans, like the Jews, expected a Messiah. And when she hears Jesus' response, she affirms this sort of, "I know that the Messiah is coming someday." But the gospel truth, the truth that Jesus is proclaiming, is that the eternal kingdom, that he is here and now. And in verse 26, Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." And Jesus there proclaims that he is the Messiah. The conversation ends here with this I am statement as the disciples return and interrupt. But the woman becomes the first evangelist, taking her new spiritual understanding to the people in her town, and as a result, many come to believe in Jesus because of her testimony. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope that you'll join us this Sunday morning for worship, and let's see together what the preacher does with this text.